Before we begin, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. It helps this documentary reach more viewers, and trust me, this is a story you'll want to follow to the very end. They called him the most isolated man in America. A prisoner who spent 36 years in solitary confinement, locked away deeper than anyone else in the federal system. But behind the concrete, steel, and silence lies a story the government rarely talks about. The rise, the violence, and the death of Thomas Edward Silverstein, the man ADX Florence tried to erase. Thomas Edward Silverstein was not born into the darkness that would later define his life, but the shadows were always close behind him. Born in 1952 in Long Beach, California, he grew up in a turbulent household marked by instability, fractured relationships, and a sense of displacement that followed him everywhere. His biological father disappeared early, and his mother remarried a man who rejected Tom from the start, refusing to give him the Silverstein name. By the time his stepfather finally adopted him at age 7, the damage was done. Tom felt like an outsider in his own home. As a teenager, Silverstein drifted into petty theft, truancy, and street trouble. By his late teens, he was rapidly entangled in crimes more serious than he understood. What began as small-time delinquency escalated into robberies involving groups of older, more dangerous men. Silverstein, young and impulsive, followed the momentum of the streets without seeing the long-term consequences. When he was arrested at 19 for armed robbery, the courts showed no mercy. It was 1971, an era of harsh sentencing, overcrowded prisons, and an emerging subculture of violent prison gangs. Silverstein was sent to the California Youth Authority and later to federal custody. His early prison years were marked by a consistent pattern. He was soft-spoken but refused to be intimidated. Prisons at that time were pressure cookers filled with race wars, gang politics, and survival based on allegiance. It didn't take long for his quiet defiance to catch the attention of the Aryan Brotherhood, the white supremacist prison gang that dominated the penitentiary system through calculated violence and rigid hierarchy. But Silverstein's path to prison infamy didn't start with the Aryan Brotherhood. It started with a transfer, one that would change his life forever. In 1975, he was sent to USP Leavenworth, one of America's most dangerous penitentiaries. Leavenworth was a jungle of criminal factions, each fighting for control. Silverstein, still young and unprepared, quickly learned that the only way to survive was to align with someone. He found himself surrounded by inmates who measured respect by ferocity, not loyalty or intelligence. In that environment, neutrality was impossible. A man with no allies was a man with no future. It was here that Silverstein met members of the Aryan Brotherhood, men who saw potential in his willingness to stand firm, take orders, and react without hesitation. Over time, he became associated with them, though he would later insist that he was never officially initiated. Whether this was true or not, the federal government believed he was connected, and in prison, perception can be as deadly as reality. By 1980, Silverstein's name was already circulating among guards and inmates for his involvement in racial conflicts and violent altercations. The Bureau of Prisons labeled him extremely dangerous, a classification that would follow him everywhere. But the event that truly set his fate, and made him one of the most feared prisoners in America, began in the early 80s inside the walls of USP Marion, the most secure federal prison at the time. Marion was the successor to Alcatraz, built to house the inmates considered too violent or unpredictable for ordinary penitentiaries. Within these walls, tensions were at a boiling point, and the government's attempts at controlling gang violence were failing. The Aryan Brotherhood and the DC Blacks were locked in a brutal war that turned the prison yard into a battlefield. Bodies dropped. Retaliation became routine. Silverstein found himself in the center of that war, not by ambition but by circumstance. Every move he made was watched. Every rivalry was magnified. And every misunderstanding had the potential to end in blood. The conflict that would define the rest of Silverstein's life began when he was accused of murdering another inmate, Danny Atwell. Silverstein always insisted he was innocent, and many inmates supported that claim. But the government did not believe him. In 1981, he was convicted and sentenced to life without parole, a sentence built on shaky testimony and circumstantial evidence. Once that label was attached to his name, prison authorities treated him as a confirmed assassin. His life spiraled into a cycle of isolation, aggression, and escalating hostility with prison staff. This was the beginning of the transformation. This was the moment when Thomas Silverstein stopped being an inmate and became a symbol, feared, hated, and eventually buried alive in a cell the public was never meant to see. And the next chapter would plunge him into the event that sealed his fate forever. The killing of Officer Merle Clutts, an act that would condemn Silverstein to decades of silence inside the deepest hole in America. The transfer to USP Marion was supposed to contain Thomas Silverstein, not empower him. By 1981, Marion had already shifted into what the Bureau of Prisons described as a control unit, a place designed to isolate the most violent men in America. Every move was monitored. Every step was recorded. Every inmate was treated as a potential knife waiting to strike. But Marion was also a pressure cooker. Gangs ruled the tiers. Racial alliances dictated who lived comfortably and who lived in constant fear. The Aryan Brotherhood and the DC Blacks were at the center of a vicious feud, fueled by years of retaliation, insults, and stabbings. In this environment, a man with any association, real or perceived, was automatically part of the war. Silverstein was already serving a life sentence for the controversial murder of inmate Danny Atwell, a killing he maintained he never committed. But the label of murderer inside Marion meant something very different from outside. It meant you were placed on a track where violence was expected. It meant your enemies multiplied overnight. And it meant staff viewed you as permanently dangerous. In 1982, things took a darker turn. Prison officials accused Silverstein of killing a rival gang member, Robert Chappelle Johnson, a high-ranking figure in the DC Blacks. The feud between Chappelle and the Aryan Brotherhood had been simmering for years. When Johnson was found dead, stabbed repeatedly, prison intelligence immediately linked the killing to Silverstein and the Aryan Brotherhood. Silverstein again denied involvement. He claimed the government was targeting him because of previous accusations, not evidence. But inside Marion, guilt didn't require proof. The killing of a major gang leader demanded a response, and the federal government's response was blunt. They declared the Aryan Brotherhood the most dangerous domestic prison gang in the nation, and they labeled Silverstein as one of its key enforcers. It was after this murder that Marion's officers were told something unusual: avoid Silverstein at all costs. Do not interact more than necessary. Do not antagonize. Do not escalate. The administration believed he had nothing left to lose and therefore could not be deterred. But not every officer agreed with this approach. Among the guards was a veteran correctional officer named Merle Eugene Clutts, a man described as stern, traditional, and by the book. Clutts believed inmates could be controlled through discipline and structure. And he believed that giving someone like Silverstein too much leeway was an invitation for chaos. Over time, tension grew between Clutts and Silverstein. Silverstein later claimed that Clutts harassed him constantly, searching his cell, taking his art supplies, moving him from cell to cell without reason, and intentionally humiliating him. The Bureau of Prisons denied this. But whatever the truth was, the hostility between them was real, escalating with every small confrontation. By 1983, the conflict reached its breaking point. On October 22, Silverstein was moved under escort to a new cell. Officer Clutts was overseeing the transfer. According to official reports, another guard, Officer Kaiser, was assisting. Silverstein, handcuffed and controlled, saw an opportunity that no one thought possible. With the help of another inmate and an unlocked door, still a subject of controversy, Silverstein broke free of his restraints. What happened next unfolded in seconds. He rushed toward Officer Clutts. Armed with a sharpened piece of metal, Silverstein stabbed Clutts repeatedly in a violent assault that left the officer mortally wounded on the floor. Other guards rushed in, but it was too late. Clutts died inside the cell block, becoming one of the few federal correctional officers murdered in the line of duty. The killing sent shockwaves through the Bureau of Prisons. It was unprecedented. A high-security inmate killing a guard inside what was supposed to be the most controlled environment in America. Marion immediately locked down. Every inmate was confined to their cell. The warden declared the facility in emergency status for nearly a month. For Silverstein, the consequences were swift and permanent. The Bureau of Prisons announced that he would be placed under no human contact status. Not for a year. Not for 10 years. But indefinitely. He was moved into a cell specifically designed for him, an isolation unit within the already isolated prison. He was cut off from other inmates, recreation, and physical human interaction of any kind. Even his food was delivered through a slot. Guards avoided speaking to him. He was treated as a ghost inside the system. This was the moment that birthed the legend of the most isolated man in America. And yet, this was not the end. The prison system believed that removing Silverstein from human contact would break him. Instead, it turned him into a symbol of controversy, fear, and debate. Because in the years that followed, Silverstein did the unthinkable. He adapted. He endured. And he outlived the very prison policies built to psychologically destroy him. In the next chapter, the government would discover that burying a man alive is far more complicated than locking a door. After the killing of Officer Merle Clutts, the Bureau of Prisons made a decision unlike anything seen before in American corrections. Thomas Edward Silverstein would be removed from the ordinary inmate population forever. Not for a fixed term. Not until he showed good behavior. But for life, inside a cell built to erase a man without technically executing him. The prison system already knew solitary confinement was psychologically crushing. But for Silverstein, they created a form of isolation that surpassed any known standard. Officials called it no human contact status. Journalists, lawyers, and former wardens would later call it something else. A life sentence inside a concrete tomb. Following the murder, the federal government transferred Silverstein from Marion's control unit to a specially designed isolation chamber deep inside the prison. The cell was small, windowless, and soundproofed. It contained a concrete slab for a bed, a stainless steel toilet, a sink, and almost nothing else. There was no communal yard time, no contact visits, no group recreation, no speaking to other prisoners, and almost no conversation with staff. Even meals were delivered through a slot, with guards instructed to limit communication to the absolute minimum. This was not a standard segregation cell. It was a behavioral experiment, an attempt to remove a man from the human world while keeping him biologically alive. The most astonishing part is that this extreme isolation was not court-ordered. It was administrative, bureaucratic. A policy decision justified by Silverstein's history of violence and his alleged role in prison gang activity. The government feared he might attack again, recruit others, or undermine prison control. So they made him an island inside the federal system. For the first few years, Silverstein lived in complete silence. In interviews years later, he said he didn't hear another human voice outside of orders shouted through steel doors. Days blurred together, weeks felt like hallucinations. He claimed his muscles weakened from the lack of movement, his vision deteriorated from the monotony of concrete walls, and his sense of time dissolved completely. Prison officials attempted to frame it as a necessary safety measure. Critics argued it was psychological torture. In 1987, a federal judge reviewing his conditions described them as confinement in a setting approaching that of sensory deprivation. Still, the Bureau of Prisons insisted it was the only practical way to house a man they believed incapable of rehabilitation or safe management. But Silverstein did not collapse. Against all odds, he adapted. To stay sane, he developed rigid daily routines. He meditated. He exercised in tiny spaces. He drew for hours with whatever art supplies the prison reluctantly allowed. His drawings, abstract, emotional, sometimes haunting, became his only form of expression. They were mailed to outside supporters, eventually gaining attention from journalists and prisoner rights advocates. But prison officials saw this as a problem. Public sympathy was not part of the plan. For them, the mission was simple: cut Silverstein off until he ceased to be a threat, or until time ended the problem naturally. In 1989, the Bureau of Prisons transferred him again, this time to USP Atlanta, placing him inside another high-security isolation chamber constructed specifically for him. This cell featured even thicker doors, reinforced walls, and a security protocol so restrictive that staff were forbidden from even standing within arm's reach of him. Silverstein often described it as being buried alive. The psychological impact of extreme solitary confinement on any human being is severe. Experts warn that long-term isolation can cause hallucinations, paranoia, panic attacks, insomnia, personality changes, and irreversible cognitive damage. But Silverstein continued to show remarkable resilience. Despite decades of pressure designed to break him, he maintained focus, clarity, and an unexpected sense of calm. Still, his humanity was steadily eroding. He spoke about imagining conversations with people he had not seen in decades. He described developing emotional attachments to insects that entered his cell. He kept mental calendars, memorized tiny details on the walls, and created routines to keep his mind from dissolving into chaos. By the early 1990s, his story began gaining media attention. Reporters were fascinated by the idea of an inmate kept in solitary for years on end. Lawsuits were filed on his behalf, arguing that his conditions violated the Eighth Amendment prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. The government pushed back, insisting Silverstein was uniquely dangerous, a man who had murdered 2 inmates and a correctional officer. Then, in the mid-1990s, everything changed again. The federal government opened a new prison, one unlike any ever built. ADX Florence. A supermax designed to house the worst of the worst. a fortress built in the mountains of Colorado. A place where isolation was not the exception but the rule. For the Bureau of Prisons, there was no question where Silverstein belonged. In 2005, after more than 2 decades of total isolation, he was transferred to the most secure cell block within ADX. Administrators believed they had finally found a facility capable of managing him for the rest of his life. They were right. And yet, what happened next reveals something deeper. An exploration of what happens to a human mind when the world removes all light, all contact, and all purpose for 36 consecutive years. In the next chapter, we enter the belly of America's most feared prison, ADX Florence, the Alcatraz of the Rockies. When the Bureau of Prisons completed ADX Florence in 1994, they marketed it as the answer to an unmanageable problem. Some inmates were simply too violent, too unpredictable, or too influential to be held anywhere else. ADX was built to cage men the system feared: cartel leaders, terrorists, gang shot callers, spies, political extremists, and the most dangerous killers from every federal facility in the country. But among them all, one name stood out long before he even arrived: Thomas Edward Silverstein. He was not the first to enter ADX, but for years he was considered the one man the prison had effectively been designed for. After more than 2 decades of extraordinary isolation at Marion and Atlanta, Silverstein's arrival at ADX in 2005 was not a typical transfer. It was a strategic placement, an attempt to institutionalize a system of control so complete that human contact would be nearly eliminated without drawing the attention that his earlier conditions had sparked. ADX Florence was designed as a fortress inside a desert wasteland. Surrounded by razor wire, gun towers, and sweeping Colorado mountains, it appeared more like a military bunker than a prison. Every detail served a purpose. The walls were made of reinforced concrete several inches thick. Doors were solid steel. The windows, if an inmate had one, were angled to prevent seeing anything except a sliver of sky. Silverstein was placed in the most secure range inside the prison, Range 13, known unofficially as the Tomb. It housed inmates under the federal system's most restrictive status. Most prisoners were locked in their cells for 23 hours a day. Silverstein, however, had additional restrictions, carryovers from his decades-long classification as a no-human contact inmate. His new home was an 8 by 12-foot concrete cell. It contained a concrete bed frame, a concrete desk, a concrete stool fixed to the floor, a stainless steel sink and toilet combination, a small slit-like window aimed toward nothing, a steel door with food slot and restraints port. Everything else was forbidden. Even among the extremely dangerous inmates of ADX, Silverstein's level of isolation was unmatched. Others could shout through their doors and sometimes hear faint responses from the tier. Others had limited group rec time, or could speak with officers during escort. Silverstein had none of that. He existed in what was essentially a personalized micro-prison inside the supermax. The daily routine at ADX was predictable, controlled down to the second. Inmates were awakened for breakfast served through their food slot. Guards, protected by layers of security, rarely spoke more than a word or two. Silverstein was allowed 1 hour of exercise a day in a small individual recreation pen, an outdoor concrete box topped with steel mesh, often described as a dog run for humans. There was no view of the mountains that surrounded the prison. No sunlight except what crept through chain-link shadows. Even at ADX, Silverstein's reputation preceded him. Many guards had heard stories of the Marion murder, of the years of isolation, of his rumored involvement with the Aryan Brotherhood. Some feared him. Others believed the myths that had grown around his name. As a result, they kept their distance, both by protocol and by instinct. His only consistent interaction was with silence. Yet even in the most restrictive prison in America, Silverstein found small ways to maintain his identity. He continued drawing, meticulous ink and pencil illustrations mailed to supporters who had followed his story for years. He wrote long letters describing his conditions, his reflections, and the internal war he fought against loneliness. He often signed them "Your Friend Tommy," revealing a softer personality that contrasted sharply with the violent legend the Bureau of Prisons had cultivated. Over time, his relationship with isolation changed. At ADX, he was no longer the only man living under near-total sensory deprivation. Many inmates around him were extremists, violent gang leaders, or high-profile terrorists. For the first time in decades, he wasn't alone in his suffering, though he was still physically separated from everyone else. Still, ADX did not break him. But it did something slower. Something quieter. It aged him. By the time he reached his mid-60s, Silverstein's hair had thinned to near baldness. His once fit body grew frail from decades of confinement. His vision deteriorated. He developed heart problems. His posture slouched from spending most of his life hunched in cells too small to stretch in. Even the guards noted that he had evolved from a fierce inmate into an elderly man fighting biology more than authority. For all the controversy that surrounded him, Silverstein's existence at ADX became a strange contradiction. He was viewed by many officers as a ghost from an older, more brutal era of federal prisons, an era defined by open warfare between gangs and guards. Younger officers had not been alive when he killed Merle Clutts. They knew his name but not his rage. What they saw instead was a tired man, worn down by 36 years of near-total solitary. A living reminder of what extreme isolation could do to a human body, and what it took for someone to survive it. Still, the government refused to remove his restrictions. They feared that relaxing his status, even at an age when he could barely lift his own artwork, could send the wrong message. He was to die in isolation. And that day was approaching. His health was declining faster than the Bureau of Prisons could document. Behind the steel doors of ADX Florence, Thomas Silverstein was becoming something no one could have predicted. A man the system didn't know what to do with anymore. He was too old to be a threat, too notorious to be freed from isolation, and too broken to be moved among ordinary inmates. In the next chapter, the final chapter in his life begins. The unraveling of Thomas Silverstein's health and the controversial circumstances surrounding his death. By the early 2010s, Thomas Edward Silverstein had become something rare in the federal prison system. A legend who had outlived nearly everyone who helped create his myth. Former wardens, former gang members, former correctional officers. Most were long retired or dead. But Silverstein remained in his concrete tomb at ADX Florence, aging slowly, painfully, and almost invisibly. For decades, the Bureau of Prisons portrayed him as a monster who would kill again the moment he was given a chance. But as the years passed, the narrative began to crumble. The once feared inmate who had stabbed a correctional officer in 1983 was no longer the muscular, rage-driven 31-year-old who had terrified staff at USP Marion. He had become a frail, elderly man who had spent more time in isolation than any other federal inmate in recorded history. Even some officers who supervised him in his later years admitted privately that he no longer resembled the violent figure described in policy manuals. With his thin frame, soft voice, and weakening health, Silverstein had become a shadow of himself, still dangerous in bureaucratic theory but not in reality. Yet despite his age, despite his deteriorating physical state, and despite the mounting criticism of his decades-long isolation, the Bureau of Prisons refused to change his conditions. Silverstein was trapped in a sentence that had no legal definition, no measurable endpoint, and no path to mercy. By 2015, reports from people who corresponded with Silverstein described a man struggling with chronic heart issues, major back pain from decades on concrete furniture, failing eyesight, breathing problems, circulatory issues, and emotional exhaustion from a lifetime of confinement. Even so, he tried to maintain his routines, exercise in tiny circles, artwork at his desk, meditation, long letters written in small handwriting because his vision blurred frequently. However, ADX Florence was not a hospital. It was not built to care for old, sick, or disabled inmates. Many prisoners there were younger, high-risk offenders. But as Silverstein approached his late 60s, it became impossible to ignore that his body was shutting down. Then, in 2019, the inevitable happened. Silverstein's health collapsed. In early spring that year, he was transferred from ADX to a federal medical facility at the same complex in Colorado. This was the first time in decades that the Bureau of Prisons openly acknowledged that his condition required specialized care. But even in the medical unit, the restrictions surrounding him remained unusually severe. On May 11, 2019, after complications during heart surgery, Thomas Edward Silverstein died. He was 67 years old. The man once labeled the most dangerous prisoner in America died not in a prison riot, not in a violent confrontation, but on an operating table, far away from the concrete cell that had defined his life for nearly 4 decades. Almost immediately, controversy filled the vacuum. For years, prisoner rights advocates had argued that Silverstein's treatment amounted to torture. They argued that human beings were not biologically or psychologically capable of surviving decades without human interaction. They claimed that even prisoners who committed horrific crimes retained basic rights in a civilized society. Some critics asked whether the government had effectively executed him through isolation, just very slowly. Others pointed out that the federal system had never shown any interest in rehabilitating him, not even when he was no longer physically capable of harming anyone. They questioned whether the Bureau of Prisons held onto the myth of Silverstein more tightly than the reality of the man. Even former guards were divided. Some believed his punishment was deserved and overdue. Others admitted that keeping a man in solitary for more than 36 years was unprecedented, unnecessary, and morally questionable. A few even wondered privately whether the system itself had become too dependent on extreme isolation, using it not to control violence, but to eliminate difficult inmates from the administrative landscape. The Bureau of Prisons released only a brief statement acknowledging his death, with no reflection on his decades of isolation. No introspection. No comment on whether such treatment would ever be used again. Just a factual note that a 67-year-old inmate had died due to surgical complications. His death closed the final chapter of his life, but not the debate surrounding it. Because Silverstein did something no one expected. He survived long enough for the world to start questioning the very practices used to break him. In 2011, even the European Court of Human Rights reviewed ADX conditions while examining the extradition of terrorism suspects to the U.S. Their conclusion was staggering. They found that the extreme isolation at ADX, conditions Silverstein helped define, did not violate international human rights standards. Yet many human rights groups disagreed, calling ADX a clean version of hell. Silverstein's case became the most extreme example cited by those who believe that solitary confinement, when used for decades, is indistinguishable from psychological torture. His story sparked academic studies, legal challenges, and documentaries. His name turned into a symbol, not of strength or brutality, but of what happens when a system locks a man away and throws away the key. In death as in life, he remained a paradox. A murderer, a victim, a monster, a warning. Depending on who told the story, Thomas Silverstein was either the reason that ADX was necessary, or the reason it should be torn down. His legacy is complicated, conflicted, and deeply American. But his story is not finished. To understand the full picture, we must go back, before the isolation, before the killings, before ADX, to examine the world of federal prisons that helped create men like Silverstein in the first place. Because he was not an anomaly. He was a product. And the next chapter reveals the system that shaped him, broke him, and ultimately buried him. Silence hangs over the empty cell in Range 13. The metal bed. The slot in the door. The fluorescent light that never truly turned off. It all remains exactly as Thomas Silverstein left it. For 36 years this was his world. A concrete box inside America's most secure prison. A place designed to break the mind, yet it became the only reality he knew. His story forces an uncomfortable question we still struggle with today. How far should a country go to punish the people it fears the most? Is a life in total isolation justice, or something darker? And whether you see him as a monster, a product of violence, or a warning about unchecked prison power, one thing is undeniable. Thomas Silverstein's death didn't just end a life. It closed the chapter on one of the most controversial experiments in American corrections. But the debate he left behind? That debate isn't going anywhere. If you want more deep, investigative stories like this, prison mysteries, criminal psychology, hidden scandals, make sure you subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay with this channel. This story is only one piece of a much bigger world we're uncovering. Thank you for watching. Stay safe, and stay curious.